Greetings all, and welcome back to Lucas Brews. In today's video, we're going to be having a paint of the 1/72nd scale Zvezda Panther Ausf D. Previously, I've done a video on building this kit, so if you haven't seen that, go check that one out before watching this video. Unfortunately, as I mentioned in my inbox review, the Zvezda instructions in terms of painting leave a little bit to be desired, and they definitely could have learnt a thing or two from Zvezda's guide. Fortunately, there are quite a few reference photos out there of the Panther and various different camouflage patterns. Generally, they were applied in the field by the crew, so they tended to vary quite a lot in terms of quality and pattern style. For this kit, I decided to experiment with a more faded paint job kind of look, which I hadn't tried before, and I also decided to test out the Vallejo Model colour set for the German armoured colours and see how they compared to the Tamiya colours I'm used to using. I squeezed out a little bit of Vallejo 976 buff onto a sheet of cardboard to use as a palette, and then I applied it onto the model with a brush. I used a tiny bit of water to help thin the paints, and then I started to apply it at a relatively quick speed so that the paint wouldn't dry on me while I was still applying it, and as much as possible I'd apply the paint from the front of the vehicle heading backwards to help reduce visible brush strokes. I also paint the upper and lower hulls separately so that I have an area of the model I can hold onto when I'm painting the other. I use the same technique when painting the turret, only this time I hold onto the turret ring, and for the accessories such as the wheels and the side skirts I hold onto the sprue or a section of the wheels when possible. You'll notice that the layers of paint I apply are still pretty opaque since you can see the plastic colour underneath. That's because I like to build up my paint in layers, which helps reduce the chances of brush strokes showing through and also helps create a more uniform and smooth finish. I paint the lower hull and its suspension arms once the upper hull is dry and I can hold onto it, and then once that layer has dried I can then apply a second coat over the entire model. I apply the second coat in much the same fashion I did with the first coat, making sure to apply the paint in the same direction as much as possible, making sure it's not too thick when I apply it, and making sure I have a section I'm not painting initially so I can hold on to the model. And as you can see, the colour of the model is starting to look a lot more brighter and uniform after the second layer. Once the second coat has dried, I add a third and final layer of Dunkelgelb, or in this case Vallejo buff, to the model, and I'm satisfied with the base paint. I did notice while painting with the Vallejo colours that they seem to be of a much better quality than the Tamiya ones, especially for when you're hand painting. They don't seem to need much water to thin them down, they come pretty well mixed and you don't have to do much stirring, and there are a lot less brush strokes than you would get with Tamiya. Unfortunately, I lost the footage of applying the first coat of the camouflage, which was 872 chocolate brown. However, I have here the footage of applying 890 refractive green, which was the second coat, and it was applied in an identical fashion. I basically got a much finer brush and used a little bit of water to help thin the paint, and then applied it on in a random sort of pattern with the green overlapping the brown. Since I was going for a faded airbrush look, I wanted the paint to be nice and thin and only ended up doing a single layer because I found that the Vallejo paints were much more bright and vibrant than the Tamiya ones. In fact, if I was going to have a second attempt at this, I would definitely have thinned them a lot more, as I found that although the colours seemed pretty accurate, they were very dark and a lot stronger than I had wanted them to initially. Even after I applied a coat of buff over the top of them, which is what will come next, I still found that they were quite strong. When painting the camouflage lines, I painted the hull separately, but once it had dried I then put the turret on so that I could match up all the lines and make sure it looked correct. There are probably a few spots where I made the lines a little bit thicker than I had intended, but I was still pretty happy with the result and could definitely notice a jump in the quality between the Tamiya and the Vallejo paints, even if I still had to learn how to use them a little bit better. And once the refractive green and the chocolate brown had both dried, I then applied a very thin coat of buff over the top of them to help soften the model. At first I was a bit concerned that the brush strokes were going to become a lot more visible since I'd just painted a light colour over a dark one. However, I found that the Vallejo paints were so smooth that it was barely noticeable, and it definitely achieved the softening result I was hoping for. In fact, I might even next time do a second coat of buff and see if that makes it even more subtle. However, I was happy enough with the results I got for a first try. Continuing on with the use of Vallejo, I used 950 flat black to paint the rubber onto the rims of the road wheels. Since the rim has a raised area of plastic, you can thin the black with a little bit of water and gently follow the curves of the road wheels, and you'll get a pretty accurate result. And after I'd painted all the rubber, I then went along with the fine brush and a little bit of buff and neatened up any mistakes I'd made. And with the painting complete, I could move on to adding the decals. The marking options included were both for tanks from the Battle of Kursk. I chose to do number 445, and after letting the decals soak in a bit of clean water for around about 20 seconds, I then slid them into place on the model using a fine brush. Once I'd moved them around a little bit with either my fingers or the brush and a little bit of water to help them slide, I then dabbed a little bit of Vallejo decal softener onto them using a cotton tip. The decal softener makes them a little bit more malleable and bendy over some of the harder surfaces, and then I applied a bit of Tamiya decal adhesive to help them adhere to the model and stay down. I then left the model aside for 24 hours to let the decals dry and moved my attention to the tracks. The tracks themselves were painted 2 coats of Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium off screen, and after that had dried, I applied a coat of Tamiya panel liner Ascent Black to highlight the details. I then set the tracks aside, and after waiting for the decals, it was time for a little bit of weathering.